All right.
So you are all warned that if you're in pajamas or if you break into song, you are likely to be recorded. So just so that you're aware. And we are going to turn it over to Dave, and he will give us a presentation and invite some conversation and discussion either as we go along or at the end. Dave?
And I'm going to try to screen share. See if, where is it? Okay. Oh. There we go.
There you go.
Okay. A bridge over troubled waters. I'm on this issue. I'm really into old rock songs like Both Sides Now and A Bridge Over Troubled Waters, and I got a couple others, but I won't play any of those, primarily because of my technical deficiency in being able to figure out how to play them over Zoom. But I wanted to talk today about, I guess, three things. How serious is our division? What are some of the reasons given by people for what's caused the division? And what are some ideas people have had about how to overcome them? And I've used basically these 6 publications for pulling this material together, and I haven't made attributions anywhere, but one is How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them. It's written by a professor, a woman at the University of California, is in a group that for years has advised the CIA on countries in which there's a risk of civil war. And in the process of doing that, and I say years, I think it's really been decades. In the process of doing that, the people involved in the project have developed a certain number of criteria that they look at for predicting how great a risk of civil war is. And by civil war, she doesn't mean like our Civil War, where there's geographical division and parts fighting against each other, although sometimes it can be that. What she's basically talking about is political violence being used at an increasing level to try to resolve disputes or government. The next one is one that I think I've mentioned before, and I think we're going to have Stuart Comstock-Gay from the Delaware Community Foundation give a presentation to us on a Sunday morning on this book. I never thought of it that way. It's a book written by a woman whose parents are Mexican immigrants, and she's a liberal, a journalist, and they are Trump supporters, 2016 and 2020. And she has developed a number of thoughts about what has caused this kind of division and how to overcome it or deal with it. There's another publication that I just read, just got an email from a fellow by the name of David French, who's an editor of a conservative publication called Dispatch. He's now just been retained by the New York Times to be a columnist for them. He's a former editor for the National Review, which is sort of the first conservative journal. Bill Buckley's conservative journal started back probably in the 50s, I think. He's a Harvard law grad, and he wrote a book called Divided We Fall, which got pretty good reviews. The next thing is an article that was in the New York Times Magazine just before, or maybe it was in the New York Times, just before Christmas. The date I have here is December 21st, was The Civil War Inevitable? And it's by a professor from Yale who talks about the events leading up to our Civil War and draw some analogies between what happened then and what's happening now that we'll come back to. This next one I didn't use much. America's coming age of instability, why constitutional crises and political violence could soon be the norm. It's by two professors. It was in the Foreign Affairs Quarterly, which is the publication of the Foreign Relations Council, which is, I suppose, maybe one of the most prestigious foreign relations publications in the country. And they had predicted for back in 2017, when Trump was first elected, that he would not concede his loss in the 2020 election. And everybody poo-pooed their prediction, and they turned out right. So now they're making other predictions about how challenging, maybe dire is the right word, our situation. And as the last is a book I did a class on at the church years ago, back in, I don't remember when I did the class, it's probably about 2012 or 2014, called Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, by Jonathan Haidt, who was a professor at UVA when he wrote the book, and now is at NYU. And he's had something of a interesting history, because he wrote this book trying to explain political and religious division, and he did it in a way that I thought was the best explanation I'd ever heard. And he was somewhat critical of the Democrats, not so much for their positions on anything, but how they couldn't talk the language of values, to put it succinctly. And there was a backlash against him among progressives and in the universities. And he's become somewhat, I don't want to say embittered, but upset about what he experienced, and is now becoming a significant critic of the cancel culture. But I think his book was, I just thought his book was excellent. So how divided are we, and why should we try to heal these divisions? I guess for me, the answer to the question of why should we try to heal the divisions wasn't self-evident to me. I mean, my reaction for even at the beginning of the Trump administration was that it was hopeless to try to bridge the divide, because nobody's going to listen on the other side and the differences are too great. But what convinced me that regardless of what I thought the prospects were for overcoming the divisions, we needed to make a try, was the book that I mentioned more about the professor who evaluated certain nations to try to predict their risk of civil war. And she applied the criteria that the CIA has been using for other nations, apparently with some degree of success, at least in terms of predictability, and applied it to the United States, and came to the conclusion that we were beginning down the road towards political violence. And now, of course, we're sort of on that road now with what happened on January 6th. Her book was written, I think, about a year before January 6th. So it hadn't happened yet. And I thought, after I read her book, I was convinced we got to try to turn this around. I mean, whether we succeed or not, we've got to make the effort, because the alternative is not going to be a good one. My own sense of our prospects for doing that has been encouraged by the results of the midterm elections. Modestly, it seemed like those who were engaging in election denial. Those candidates, at the most extreme of them, were defeated, at least in battleground states, if not in states, in redder states where there's not the prospect of a close election almost under any situation. But I think when you look at the red-blue divide among the states, that it's not much better. And the closeness of the elections, even in what are now battleground states, doesn't give me a lot of hope. But then the last thing in terms of what are the prospects, I read this article about the events leading up to the United States Civil War. And one of the historian was talking about, there's usually a turning point, as he puts it, some point at which the division becomes so profound that people on both sides lose faith in the other side. They become convinced there's just no possibility of compromise. And once they reach that state, once they conclude, as frankly I tentatively concluded at the beginning of the Trump administration, that this is going to be a fight, I used the phrase to the death, and I don't mean to suggest literally to the death, although I was using it metaphorically then. I don't know now that it's not literally the case, but that it would be a fight to the death, and that there would be no hope of reconciliation. It was only a matter of trying to win the fight. And now I don't feel that way, and I don't feel like I can think that way anymore. But the event before the Civil War that this historian said was the turning point where the Civil War became inevitable was the Dred Scott decision. And if you remember, I won't go into the depths of the Dred Scott decision, but the basic decision was one that basically said, you cannot, no states and Congress cannot eliminate slavery. That slavery is a constitutionally protected right, that slaves are property, they're constitutionally protected property, and any state that tries to ban slavery or tries to free slaves, or even including slaves that are brought into that state, those laws are all ineffective under our Constitution. It was a decision that effectively gutted the Missouri Compromise and any other compromise that Congress might come up with on the slavery question. And the Supreme Court, headed by Chief Justice, Taney, who lived in Maryland, the Supreme Court thought they were ending the slavery issue for the country. There was a lot of sense that we've got this terrible division over slavery. Somebody needs to resolve this question one way or the other. And the Supreme Court thought they were resolving it by this decision. But instead, what they did was make the Civil War almost at that point an inevitability, because both sides gave up on believing that the other side could ever compromise. And once you believe that, once you think there's nothing but a fight to the end, then that will be a self-fulfilling prophecy. And in that, and this author, and I'm not sure the legal analogy is correct, but he equates the Supreme Court's recent abortion decision with the Dred Scott decision. Now, it may be from a political perspective, it may be that it is perceived that way by the public. It may be that it has cast that issue in such a frame that there's no possibility of compromise on it. And it's also that decision as a legal matter put into doubt the same-sex marriage decisions, the decisions against that you have a right to the use of contraceptives, every privacy right decision that the Supreme Court has issued over the last 50 years under some interpretations of that case are at risk. I should say the majority opinion in that case tried to make it clear that they are not at risk, but it's not. And there is a basis to distinguish the abortion decision from every other area in which privacy rights have been established. But in any event, the other thing that the other distinction between the abortion decision and Dred Scott is Dred Scott took the issue of slavery out of the hands of the states and made it a uniform rule throughout the United States and its territories that you couldn't get rid of slavery. And the abortion decision does the reverse. It puts the decision back in the hands of the states. And there's going to be obviously a tremendous fight over it. The real battle lines are going to be over what states that ban abortion can do to prevent activities that occur in states where abortion is permitted, if those activities affect the availability of abortion in the states where it's prohibited. There's going to be some huge battles over that. But one of the things that this author noted in the article was a recent University of Virginia poll where 52% of the Trump voters and 41% of the Biden voters at least somewhat agreed that Americans are so fractured that they would favor that the people being polled would actually favor secession over keeping the Union together. I mean, that's a startling poll. So we've got a real issue. Causes. I'm going to come back to very briefly to the evolution of civilization analysis that I've used before, because we are in what Carol Quigley, who developed that methodology, would call an age of conflict. And in an age of conflict, there is tremendous division. The division is being caused, or the conflict is being caused, under his theory, by the social instruments that are used to meet social objectives, political, economic, military, in various areas, have become less functional or dysfunctional. And it's that dysfunction or declining functionality that creates the friction that causes the conflict. I think there's a lot of truth to that, and where it takes you, if you agree with it, is that the solution to the problem is less dealing with the symptoms of the conflict than dealing with the causes of the dysfunction. And I'm not sure which is easier. The righteous mind explores the nature of the division between conservatives and liberals and moderates. And I'll try to summarize it with 2 points. Point number one is that people make moral judgments not based on rational analysis or reasoning. People make moral judgments intuitively, almost unconsciously. In fact, I think they would say unconsciously. And there's a plethora of studies and experiments that have been done to try to prove both those things, that we make our moral judgments unconsciously, and then we use our reasoning process to try to rationalize the judgments we've come to. And he says that the reasons we reach the intuitive judgments that we do is there's 6 values that are tied in some way to our emotions. empathy, accountability. He goes through each of these 6 values. And what he says, the differences between conservatives and liberals are the weight that conservatives and liberals give to the respective values. Not that they disagree about any of the values. They all agree that these are legitimate values that need to be addressed and preserved. The problem comes in when with the weight that is given to those values. Liberals, for example, put a very high weight on empathy and a very low weight on authority. Conservatives, on the other hand, in the experiments that they did, gave a pretty even weight to almost every one of the values. And the way they tested it was they would create hypotheticals where the values would come into conflict. In other words, in this situation, you had to make a choice between which value are you going to effectuate and which value are you not, because the 2 values are in conflict. And they created hundreds of these hypotheticals and tested thousands of people. And the self-described liberals would consistently give higher emphasis on empathy, and the self-described conservatives would give a more equal value, which led to the common observation that liberals think conservatives are heartless, and conservatives think liberals won't hold anybody responsible for anything, that everything's just free, you can do whatever you want, and there's no accountability. And I think there is a lot of truth to that analysis, which leads me to the point that I think there's a lot of truth in both the conservative critique of our society and the liberal critique of our society. On the causes of civil war, the first factor that the studies indicate is a factor leading to civil war is that the society is moving either from an authoritarian structure to a more democratic structure, but hasn't quite reached a truly democratic structure, or is moving from a truly democratic structure to a more authoritarian structure, but hasn't reached a true authoritarian structure. And there are various groups that rate the democratic, I don't know what the word would be, democratic value or efficacy of a society. And the United States has been moving down that analysis over the years. And there's different groups that do different analyses. There's one that actually, which I find pretty incredible, that says the United States is ranked somewhere now with Argentina with respect to our adherence to democratic values and processes. But it's
7:30.
It's the process of moving from one to another. If you're in an authoritarian structure can suppress the conflict. Indeed, under Quigley's analysis of Age of Conflict, one of the reasons authoritarian structures come about is because of a desire to suppress the conflict. On the other hand, if you're a democratic society moving more towards authoritarianism, that movement creates conflict. So that was the first factor, and on that she scored the United States as beginning to exhibit that trait. The next factor is that it's not just that there's divisions among people, but the divisions are along the line of race or ethnicity, class, or religion, or ideology, something that she calls factions. And once you have division along those lines, the factionalism that exists becomes more pronounced. And there's another phenomenon that she referred to, is once you have that kind of factionalism, you have leaders, and those countries that ultimately go into civil wars or authoritarian structures have leaders that try to use those factional divisions to their political advantage. So they attempt to exploit the divisions and attempt to increase the divisions for political gain. And I think we have divisions. I think our divisions are on the line of race, class, and maybe religion, or at least religion and secularism. And so she counts us as having that attribute of creating risk of political violence. Then the third one, and I think this is true, is you have a group that was previously privileged in the society. They were doing well. They were pretty happy with where they were. And their prospects, economic, social, and otherwise, are declining. And they are beginning to lose hope that things are going to get better, and they feel like the political system isn't responding to them. And in fact, when that happens, typically the group that's declining will attribute the fact that the political system is not responding to corruption. In fact, one of the other factors of conflict that indicates you're heading towards a civil war or political violence is the increase in conspiracy theories about how things aren't working because there's people conspiring to accomplish bad ends. And we certainly have that. It seems to me more on the right than on the left, but we've got it, I think, in both ways. And then the last thing, and this is more of a modern phenomenon, is she refers to social media not so much as the cause of our divisions, although we'll come back to that point, but as an accelerant, that it accelerates these divisions and makes them worse, and makes the process by which they develop and grow occur at a faster rate. And we certainly have that. The book, I never thought of it that way, gives three other causes for the divisions that we have. In her book, Monica Guzman refers to them as SOS: sorting, othering, and siloing. Sorting is that we are, as a people, more segregated, particularly by class and income level and education level, and also still by race, than we've ever been. And if you look at the political divide, there's a pretty, the brightest lines of that divide are college educated versus those don't have a college education, urban versus those in rural areas or exurban areas. And so we are segregating ourselves, so we only socialize to an increasing extent with people who are like us in terms of their class, their race, and that class and race is a large predictor of political and social views. And so if when you say you're only you're being segregated with people of the same class and the people of the same race, you're also being segregated with people who, as a whole, tend to have the same views as you do. The next phenomenon she refers to is others. It's dehumanizing the other side. And she cites an interesting poll where they asked Republicans their views of Democrats and Democrats their views of Republicans. And they said, do you think, for example, do you think Republicans are reasonable or brainwashed? Do you think they're civil or hateful? And so the four negatives were brainwashed, hateful, racist, and arrogant. 70 to 80% of each group said the others, the people in the other group, were brainwashed, hateful, racist, and arrogant. What I found really interesting was the Republicans said the Democrats, 70 or 80% of Republicans said the Democrats were racist. Now, I think maybe what is happening there may be affirmative discrimination, affirmative action, a feeling on the Republican side that the Democrats are racist because they're favoring blacks over similarly situated whites, which I think there is some legitimate criticism to that effect. We'll come back to that. And then silos is basically the effect of being in an echo chamber where everybody agrees with you. And I'm actually working with experts on this phenomenon in a case right now that I'm I had a trial in April. But if you primarily associate with people that think like you do, your views will become more extreme. And that is a phenomenon that's now been borne out by experiments and various analyses for almost 30 years. That, and I'm using it in the context of courts and administrative panels, where if you have an administrative panel or a court that's made up of all people who agree or are like-minded, the decisions that body will make will be more extreme decisions than if you have a body that's made up of people of differing viewpoints. And there's a lot of reasons for that, including the pretty obvious one that people like to get along with one another. And when people of different viewpoints try to work together, they tend to moderate their own views to try to find a consensus and get along. There's other reasons too, but we are certainly in that echo chamber. And that echo chamber, I think, promotes the first thing of everybody thinking the worst of the other side. I have made it an effort, which is hard for me to do, of trying to watch Fox as least as often as as often as I watch MSNBC. And I don't know that I've succeeded, but the one thing I've noticed on watching both of them, and I do think maybe this is my bias, I do think Fox does this to either a greater degree or to a greater degree. But both sides, when I hear them talk about an issue that I know something about, and when I know what both sides of the argument are on the issue, each side tends to mischaracterize the views of the other side on that issue, sometimes in subtle ways, but in ways that make the other side sound more unreasonable. For instance, when I read the New York Times analysis of a Supreme Court decision, and then I go and read the Supreme Court decision, when I read the New York Times description of it, it's not that description is inaccurate, but it's oftentimes incomplete. And when I go and read the opinion, after I read the New York Times description of the opinion, I think, oh my God, what in the hell is this court doing? How could they possibly reach that result? These are terrible judges. And then I read the opinion and I hear the other side of the argument, and it typically doesn't change my view as to how the case should come out. But I no longer think that the people that thought the other way are terrible judges or bad people. I now just think I disagree with these people. But that happens a lot. And in fact, that's another phenomenon that one of the commentators talked about how each side misperceives in a verifiably inaccurate way the views of the other side. And in fact, and some people have said, well, that's because people aren't informed. Well, the more news you read or watch, the greater the degree of misperception. Because our news has become sort of as it was after the Revolutionary War. Newspapers used to be mouthpieces for political parties or political movements. So in that newspaper, you would get the view of the Federalist, or you would get the view of the Jeffersonian Democrats. I certainly substantial portions of our media have become places where either the liberal or the conservative point of view is expressed. And what's really telling is when you hear the commentators on Fox describe what liberals think, you go, that's not what liberals think. That's not accurate. But when you watch MSNBC and when I know something about what the conservatives think, I go, well, that's not exactly accurate either. So the misperceptions actually increase the more you watch, the more news you're exposed to. Then the final, God, I always run over. The final causative factor that David French talks about is that he actually makes this point about misperceptions on both sides. And his theory is that there's about 15% of the people that are activists on the liberal side. There's about a same percentage that are activists on the conservative side. And the great middle is either moderate or apathetic. I think in his view, more sort of apathetic. And that the activists have a tendency to drive the debate to extremes for four reasons that he gives. One is that they are activists because they care very much about the issue. And when you care very much about something, you tend to be very strong in your views on that. And I don't mean to suggest that that means the views are extreme, but it does mean the views are strongly held. And the views that people who disagree with you, it becomes a problem to sort of respect those views. Then the other thing he points out is the activists on both sides of this political divide need to raise money for their candidates, their issues. And if you've got to persuade people to give money, the easiest way to persuade them to give money is to persuade them there's a crisis. And the easiest way to persuade them that there is a crisis is that terrible people are about to take over if you don't do something about it. So he says that's another element of driving this increase in the political temperature. Then the other thing he says, I never would have thought of this one, is that the activists on one side tend to interact only with activists on the other side. So if I'm a progressive Democrat and I'm involved in the political process, the people I'm likely to run up against are the activists on the conservative side. I'm not likely to run up against some moderately conservative man who is almost apolitical and doesn't have really strong views one way or the other, perhaps. But because the activists interact with each other, they foster extremism might be the wrong word, although that's the word that French uses. They enhance the view of each that the other is unreasonable. And then there's the phenomenon of tribal bonding, which, as there have been countless polls where they've asked people, do you agree with X? And if they tell conservatives that the Republican Party says X, do you agree with that? The answer will be yes in 80% of the cases. And if you ask if you ask a Republican, the Democratic Party says X, do you agree with that? 80% will disagree with the same X. In other words, the views of people, and the same is true of Democrats. So the views of people are affected by whether the view being expressed is a view that you think comes from your tribe or not. Cures at a societal level. The book on Civil War suggests these: improve the quality of governance. And by that she means the rule of law, having voice and accountability. In other words, people's voices are being heard and the political system is accountable, and effectiveness. I'd actually put that in the Hegelian civilization methodology and say that if you address the underlying dysfunction and improve societal performance so that we're functioning better, you will lessen the conflict and lessen the divide. Her next cure, at a societal level at least, is address domestic terrorism, which she says has been underestimated until recently. The third is the role of leadership. You can have leaders that try to bridge the divide, and you can have leaders that try to exploit the divide. And right now we've got leaders on both sides, I think, who try to exploit the divide. But I tell you, it's really hard to know when one person is exploiting the divide and when one person is simply standing up for principle and being courageous. And then she talks about the role of media, misinformation, paranoia, and conspiracy theories. And she has a number of discussions about how to address the problem of social media and the amount of misinformation and siloing that occurs in social media. I don't know whether I agree with them, but there's certainly a problem, and I'm not sure what the cure is. At a personal level, I looked at the book. I never thought of it that way. And here's what she said, and she's talking now about how to talk with people that don't agree with you. And her first principle is humility. And I've heard David Brooks and David French speak about this, is one of the most important attributes is to really understand I could be wrong. I mean, everybody, one of my partners used to accuse me of false humility. I would always say some self-denigrating comment, and he'd go, God, don't do that false humility stuff with me. Everybody will say they acknowledge that they don't know everything and aren't always right. But for some of us, it's really hard to believe that people who disagree with you aren't wrong and you're right. And so the ability to really appreciate that I could be wrong about this is a difficult trait. And what makes it, for me at least, most difficult is once I believe that I could be wrong, how do I make decisions? Now, the answer is I got to make decisions, even realizing that I might be wrong. I've got to make decisions. I do the best I can and I make the decision, but I don't pretend that I think I'm infallible in making a decision. But it's easy for that sense of I may be wrong to lead to paralysis. The other thing is there are times when I'm not wrong, where the people that disagree with me are actually propagating evil. And I can't be humble about or accept the fact that, well, maybe I'm wrong about these people that that marched through Charlottesville chanting, the Jews won't replace me. The next thing, and this is one I never thought of, and I probably put these out of order. I probably go to the third one. She says, when you enter a conversation, you should enter the conversation to learn from the other, not to persuade them. And that ties into her point about curiosity. Her point is that you should be looking for opportunities to find moments where you have an experience of, I never thought of it that way, because that means you're growing as a person. That means you're learning. And so the most important thing is a sense of curiosity. I don't want to be exposed to people that agree with me all the time. I want to be exposed to people that disagree with me, because I find it interesting to find out why they do. And so she says curiosity is an important attribute in people overcoming this divide. The other thing she says is, don't try to ask someone their reasons like a lawyer would. What are your reasons for having that view or believing that? Because, first of all, their reasons, going back to Jonathan Haidt's righteous mind theory, the reasons they give you are probably not the real reasons why they believe what they believe. There's probably something deeper, as this woman would put it, some life experience they had that shaped their views. And if you really want to understand them, you don't want to know what their reasons are. You want to know what those life experiences were. And if you really want them to understand you, you don't give them your reasons. You explain your story, and you want to listen to their story. And so here, I made it. Here are my 3 propositions for political compromise. 1, no single political party or philosophy has a monopoly on the truth. Each has some part of it. Every idea of a Democrat is not socialism, and every idea of a Republican is not racist or reactionary. 2, I debate whether to put this in. A person who attempts to overthrow an election is not fit to be president, and those who support him are risking our democracy by doing so. I mean, I'm to the point where if I'm willing to have a dialogue, because well, that gets to, I'm to the point where that's not a compromisable principle, that a view that Donald Trump is fit to be president of the United States is not a view that I can respect. But third, even if I don't agree with that view or even respect that view, if we're going to overcome this divide, I need to understand it. And each side needs to understand the other better and attempt to address their social and political and economic needs. For example, conservative whites need to understand the legacy that racism has left behind, the economic and social legacy that racism has left behind. It is simply not realistic to think that if we simply eliminate discrimination, everything's back to even playing field. There's a huge legacy now of discrimination. How you deal with that is another question I don't have time to get into, but conservatives need to understand that, and conservatives also need to understand that unconscious bias, if not outright conscious racism, is still a large factor in the psychology of probably most whites and most people. On the other side of the divide, I think liberals need to understand that calling people racist or attributing or saying, for me, the two phrases that I think are just not well advised are systemic racism, because I think what it suggests to people who don't understand really what it means and aren't going to make any effort to find out, I think what they think that means is that everybody in this country is a conscious racist, and everybody in this country is trying to keep blacks down, and we've got a whole system and structure that's consciously designed to do that. I don't believe that about America, and I don't think that using terminology that can be misinterpreted to mean that is constructive, and it might be misunderstood by the other side. And I think we need to better understand the problem of the problem that whites have experienced in the last 20 years in terms of the deindustrialization of the country, and large parts of the country in rural and ex-urban areas being, up to now at least, largely left behind by a prosperity that they're not participating in. And we need to appreciate that problem and deal with it. And that's it for me. I'm sorry it took this long. I didn't. But I will stop screen sharing now. If I can get my. So I would invite disagreement in particular. And here's the thing that really has troubled me is because my wife and I can't tell you how many times in the morning or in the evening we'll be watching TV, and one of us will say to the other, "Those people are just despicable." and what bothers me about that reaction on our part, and then what bothers me when I say to my wife, "Well, but you know, there's another side to this argument," she gets mad at me for making the other side of the argument, is that I think that it's that sort of self-righteousness is counterproductive in overcoming this, and maybe dehumanizes the other side. On the other hand, well, and I'll say this: I've been in a situation where my family's been physically threatened.
It's 8 o'clock.
By people on the other side, threatening to kill people. And I don't feel any hesitation in saying that those people who are threatening to kill members of my family are despicable. Now, those are the two extremes. Where in the middle does your conviction that this is the right thing become, where do you draw that line? And I once had this conversation with one of our pastors, our youth pastor years ago, David, drawing a blank.
Colby.
Out in
David Colby.
Yeah, and he was lecturing on environmentalism. And he was talking about the moral the moral obligation we had to pursue environmentally sound policies. And I remember saying, it makes me uncomfortable when we talk about these issues in the context of moral issues, because once we cast them as moral issues, we've narrowed our possibility of compromise. Because if you and I are talking about priorities and where we should place our priorities, if we're talking about how do we get this done, if in terms of what process do we use to accomplish this objective, you and I can, we can, there's room for compromise in that discussion. But if this is a moral principle, how much compromising can I do? And I do think there are moral principles that you can't compromise on. I just have a hard time figuring out, where is it an issue that I can compromise on? Where is it an issue that I can't compromise on? I'd be interested in hearing people's thoughts on that, because I think as a church, we confront that in everything we do.
Roger?
I think sometimes you have to go to the science and say, I mean, in talking about environmentalism, you say it's a moral issue. Well, it is a moral issue if you believe the science.
Yeah.
That we are heading to killing so many people through starvation and storms. And if you reject the science of that, if you look at the numbers and say that's not a problem, then we can start talking about facts and numbers, and then lead on to what those facts tell us.
Mm-hmm.
So and you can also apply facts and statistics to how money is spent and what money does. And if you say, let's increase the wages of the working class, and people say, well, no, that'll cause unemployment. Well, there are facts based on that. You can look at what the other side arguments have done in terms of trickle-down economy, and then there's the bottom-up economy. And if we can find a common set of facts, it's the rejection of facts, which is so disturbing to me, than the rejection of science, because without science and facts, we don't have anything to talk about.
Well,
To me, oh, go ahead.
go ahead. I'll shut up. Go ahead, somebody else.
To me, it's along the same lines, but I was struck a number of years ago about the debate about abortion. And what someone said was, it's useful to begin with a foundational principle or fact that we can agree on.
Mm-hmm.
So in the case of abortion, let us agree that reducing the number of abortions would be a good thing. That fewer abortions would be good. So let's start with that. And then let's get into how might that be accomplished?
Yeah.
What could be done? What has worked? What hasn't worked? So any of these conversations, if you can begin with some grounding where we say, yes, we agree on this, and let's use that as a starting point and build from there. I think that provides some opportunity for story sharing, for, what's your experience? How did you get to where you are? But you need to start with, why are we having this conversation? And what at heart is important.
And I'll keep my mouth shut.
You can talk.
May I?
Yes.
I don't know that we do need to start figuring out why we're having this conversation. We can have them in much more informal situations. I had an interesting situation last week where my rental car was returned and they drove me to where my car was. And the driver was very, very fundamentalist and not well educated. And he would not, and I showed tremendous curiosity to find out how he felt. And that was very interesting because I don't normally interact with people like that. But my basic philosophy is, by and large, you can believe what you believe, but don't try to force it on me.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the points that Monica Guzman makes in her book about, she talks about that tactic, method. Yeah.
It doesn't work with climate change because that forces on me.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. Let me just say, Roger, I had an interesting experience. I'm working with a lawyer in Texas who's really delightful. I mean, he and his wife are just wonderful people. And he is, I don't want to say he's a climate denier. He admits that there's global warming, but he doesn't think that man is the primary problem. And so he calls me one day, says, I just bought a book for you. I'm sending it to you. It's written by some guy that's got, sounds great credentials. He says, this is the science. And what you're reading from your climate people is a distortion of the science. It's an exaggeration of the science. Read this book and you'll understand the science. So he is saying to me, I'm the one who didn't understand the science. And I will admit, I don't understand this. My feeling is I go with what I'm told is a scientific consensus. And my feeling also is, hey, look, if there's a 10% chance that the guys that say this is the worst case scenario might be right, we need to do something about it because that's too big of a risk to take. But it's always not so apparent to me what the facts are. And Sue, on your comment about abortion, I just reminded me of an interesting fact I heard that there were, of course, this might be true just because population is smaller, so I'm now realized, but in any event, there were fewer abortions in the year before Roe versus Wade was decided. I mean, there were more abortions. That's right. There were more abortions in the year before Roe versus Wade was decided than there were last year or the year before in the United States. And I thought that was pretty interesting, a pretty interesting legislative fact to consider when you think about if we pass all these laws. I heard a great podcast with a woman who was one of the people back in the 70s, 60s and 70s who helped women get what were then illegal abortions. And she said, I don't care what law you're going to pass. This is going to happen. And it's interesting to me that before Roe versus Wade, there were more abortions than now.
Well, and I think you have to ask the question, what else has changed in the meantime?
Yeah.
And that's the fundamental question. And if in reality you wanted fewer abortions, there are other things that could be done besides outlawing abortion, clearly, to the point that you just made. But anyway, it's an opportunity to peel back the, I'm on this side and you're on that side, and gosh, that gap between us is just unbridgeable. And I think that's what you're talking about. If we don't bridge some of these gaps, I think laws of nature or whatever, and the siloing, I mean, the studies that have been shown that we have moved to communities where people think the way we think. And so it's not that the more different people you interact with, the more different people you know, the different viewpoints, you're going to begin to see the other side, and compromise will be easier. People are moving to communities where people think the way they think. And so there has to be some way of engaging with people that aren't your next door neighbor.
Yeah.
And engaging in some sort of conversation, some sort of dialogue that is open to learning. I think you could say, all right, I could be wrong. My husband and I have that. We have a disagreement. And the end of it is, you could be right. What the underlying text is, you're not, you idiot, but I'm tired of talking about this.
Mhm.
So You know, you can go into a conversation with, you could be right, and then listen. And then in the course of listening and sharing, perhaps learning happens on both sides. It may change viewpoints, it may not. But we don't have those conversations. I'll say for myself, I have family members who are still to this day diehard Trump supporters. We don't talk about it.
Yeah.
We should. We
Yeah.
really should. But it's hard. It's painful. It's difficult. We avoid it. And I think that's a piece of what has to be overcome. We're never going to get past this or through this or better than this if we can't summon the courage and the willingness to talk about it.
Yep. And develop and try to develop the skills to be able to do that. I remember one summer, it was the summer before the 2016 election. Sally and I were staying at an inn up in just north of New Hope. And there was another couple there. We were sitting out in the backyard in our Adirondack chairs, and they came down and sat in chairs next to us. And we were having our wine, and they were having, I forget what they had, but in any event, we shared drinks and we started talking. And he was a Democratic lawyer. I think he was a lawyer he was a lawyer in the legislature. I mean, actual attorney, but he was a Trump supporter. And of course, we were avid Trump. Not. And we started sharing our stories. And the story he told was that he had lived his whole life in the legislature and he was fed up with the corruption. He was just sick of it. And somebody needed to break the system to get rid of this corruption. And as far as he was concerned, Donald Trump was the guy that was going to do that, because he just didn't think anybody else who was really part of the system would do it, and Trump was outside the system. And of course, we shared our story of why, we were terrified of the thought that Donald Trump would become president and might mount a movement that would cause our family not to be able to get jobs or marry or whatever. And they wanted to have dinner with us. The deeper we got into the conversations and the more we shared our respective stories with one another, the more we wanted to talk. And I've found that is true. A lot of times people get upset with me because I'm not afraid to talk religion or politics with people. and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work. But
well, Dave, I want to thank you for the program this evening. We are at 8:15 and we have said we'll run over, but we really do try to hold. You have promised that this is the first in an intermittent series of presentations and discussions and dialogue on the topic. Obviously, we haven't solved it tonight, nor will we with any number of these programs, but we appreciate your sharing the information and the perspectives. And I think it gives us all something to think about and to consider.
Let me throw out one last thing is I would love to get some conservative voices involved in some of these intermittent programs. And so I would, if anybody knows of conservatives in the church, might be the best, but who would be willing to participate and actually try to do some of these dialogues. Because my buddy from Texas, the lawyer I referenced before, he and I will go on for hours discussing and debating the issues, both at an abstract level and at sort of at a personal level. And we never end up agreeing at the end. I mean, he's still basically the only thing I've ever gotten him to change his view on was LGBTQ rights. When we first met him, his wife wanted to leave the Presbyterian Church because of the possibility of ordination of gays. And now she loves Sarah. And I mean, so that changed, but otherwise we don't agree on anything.
Well, I'm sure we could find somebody with a conservative viewpoint that might be and we should pick a topic. And we
Yeah.
should schedule, if not a formal debate, at least a structured dialogue with opposing points of view. So let's see if we can't pull that together. I think that would be great.
Okay, well, send me any suggestions. Thanks, everybody.
All right, thank you
so
all
much,
for being
Dave.
here.
That was great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sue.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.